And I can say in the last election, I also learned something about election fraud in the United States because I watched on television my vote go from 57,000 election night to 29,000 the next morning, and by the end of the week it was 25,000. I'm Diane Sare. I'm an independent candidate for U.S. Senate from the state of New York in the United States, and that means my election is in November of 2024. And I think what is important for everyone to know, it is the case that these upcoming elections are among the most important elections ever in American history and even in world history, because we are on the brink of a catastrophic war, even possibly world war. And unfortunately, the current administration of the United States seems to be oblivious to the results of its policies. So in the presidential election, we have three major candidates. We have Joe Biden, the incumbent president, who is very old, who doesn't seem to know where he is a lot of the time, who clearly is being advised by other people. We have Donald Trump, the former president, who is under a vicious political attack. I'm not endorsing him or any candidate myself right now, but I would say that to have a presidential candidate facing 91 criminal indictments indicate that there is a certain political nature to the targeting of this individual, and even the threat that he could be in prison by the time of the elections, which is serving to cause the American people to become very angry and to support him more than ever. So I think what we're seeing in the United States, especially with what they're doing to Donald Trump now, is that Americans actually are very interested. If someone is getting what they consider bad press, then the American people say, oh, that person must be doing something interesting. I'm going to look at what they're doing. And then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., the nephew of our assassinated president, John F. Kennedy, the son of Robert Kennedy, who probably would have been president had he not also been assassinated. Robert Kennedy Jr. has just left the Democratic Party to announce that he will run as an independent. Now, why has Robert Kennedy Jr. left the Democratic Party? Well, what many people may not understand is that the so-called Democratic Party is not terribly democratic. And the Democratic National Committee made a policy that they have decided that Joe Biden will be their candidate no matter what happens in the primary. So Robert Kennedy Jr. said, well, what is the point of people voting for me if their vote is going to count for Joe Biden? He fought for a while. He tried to fight the Democratic Party, tried to get them to change their rules. They would not. So he left the party to run as an independent. And there were polls showing that 63% of American voters supported him running independent. So there is a great recognition in the United States right now that the bureaucracy of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party no longer represents the view of the average American voter. The state rule in New York was, in the past, if you want to get your name on the ballot, you have 6 weeks in which to collect 15,000 valid signatures. Now, if you are an independent candidate, if you are not with the two major parties, you have to collect 45,000 valid signatures in 6 weeks. I ran for U.S. Senate against the incumbent Chuck Schumer in 2022, and I became the first and only person in the state of New York to actually succeed at getting on the ballot. I was the only one. I turned in 66,000 signatures, and I can say in the last election, I also learned something about election fraud in the United States because I watched on television my vote go from 57,000 election night, which was already lower than it should have been, but that's another story, but to 29,000 the next morning, and by the end of the week it was 25,000. And I can tell you there's a group in New York that's monitoring the elections. They discovered that according to the state public records, in the 2020 election, the one that Donald Trump said was fraudulent, in the state of New York, there were 300,000 more votes certified by the Secretary of State than voters who voted in the election. At least a 4% margin of votes that you can play with to change the outcome of an election. And this was done across the board, I think, in many, many states. I think there is legitimate reason to say there is fraud. I think this is a real problem in a democratic republic because the voters must have confidence that their voice is being heard. If the voters feel that they don't know that they are being heard, that they don't know that their vote counts, then you get a very dangerous situation, demoralization, frustration, maybe at some point even violence. It's very bad. So this is one problem the United States has to correct, is to create our election system in such a way that it's verifiable and the American voters have confidence in the outcome. It is very different than the hypocritical position of the United States government right now, that we are the #1 democracy. As you heard from the Democratic Party policy, we're not that democratic. As a candidate for U.S. Senate in New York, what I am hoping to do is to rally the American voters to a policy not only anti-war, but a policy of economic cooperation, economic development. And personally, I am actually very excited by the role that China is playing in the world right now, the effort to alleviate poverty, to work with other nations without making arbitrary demands on what they must do before they can get economic aid. And personally, I think the expansion of the BRICS is very exciting. I think it can help very much stabilize the world. One of the biggest debates right now is about migration. Thanks to Biden, a really uncontrolled policy at the border. I went to New York City. It's a terrible crisis because the city has brought in 1 year 110,000 migrants. So imagine a city where 1 out of 10 public school children is already homeless, and you bring in 110,000 more people who are homeless, who have to be sheltered, and you have an economy which is collapsing and there is no place for people to go. This is a situation that has many Americans very upset, and that gets at the other issue, which is the economy. We have a lot of inflation still in the United States, and thanks to our genius anti-inflationary policy of raising interest rates, no one can afford to get a loan. I have a friend who was in an accident. She needs to find a new car. The interest rate on an auto loan is 10%. So you can't buy a new car. And a used car today costs more than a new car did 3 years ago. You look at the US economy, we have this gigantic bubble. Our production has completely collapsed. We're sending $100 billion in weapons to Ukraine, to Israel, and God knows what else. Meanwhile, we have people drowning in floods. Our farmers are suffering. Our schools are falling apart. We don't have health care. We have a disaster at home. And we have the possibility actually of collaborating with the Belt and Road. We are trying to set up a competition in a way which is a fraud because we have no intention of building anything. So that's number 2. And then number 3, the issue of war. That people are very worried They maybe don't know how to express it. You're seeing Americans in the street now more because they're upset about that Israel is trying to do ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian population in Gaza. So more people are in the streets, but I think there is actually a very deep fear about nuclear war between the US and Russia. Well, a lot of Americans use the phrase deep state to discuss kind of dirty operations, like how do we have a war with Iraq when everyone knows there's no weapons of mass destruction? Why are people who are actually guilty of major crimes not going to jail, like not one single major Wall Street banker has gone to jail since 2008? I'll just say that to anyone out there who thinks you can trust the United States. You can't trust us. Not right now. Not until we make some changes.